All right, we're going to go over some JavaScript array methods today. And it looks like the stream is working. So as usual, if you're interested in asking any questions or talking through anything, looking through a project that you want to talk through together on stream, if you're not already part of the Discord, just go to ourpassion.dev, that's ourpassion.dev, and that will redirect you to the Discord. And then from the Discord, all you need to do is jump into this voice chat right here. I'll be in here, I'll be able to hear you, and we can talk through this stuff. Don't hesitate to do that. Don't worry about derailing this. I don't have any goals for this particular stream. I'm just doing this because I'm in the mood to code and I don't have a specific project to work on at the moment. So don't hesitate if there's anything you want to talk about. And also, as usual, there are no stupid questions, so don't ever feel stupid about asking something that you think might be a stupid question. This isn't Stack Overflow. You know, we're not here to hate on beginners, not by any means. So the setup that I have right now is I just have this index.html. I'm importing the script, this index, I'm sorry, not, let me restate that. We have index.html, it's running with live server, I believe on port 5000, probably, 5500. It's importing index.js, which is just this JavaScript file, and if you take a look over on the right side here, it's going to live refresh. So every time I make a change to it, it'll log everything out down here. I made it a little bit larger so it's easier to see. I figured that was the better alternative as opposed to doing this where it's going to print out in the console. What I have happening, however, is I'm using NodeMon, and so every time I update something, the console will also update. But I thought this might be a little bit easier to see. All right, so the first thing that we're going to go over today, I should probably also mention this. I'm not going to be looking at the chat. So I've got the chat popped out right here. I'm not going to see it, most likely. So if you want to get my attention, if you don't want to jump into the voice chat, just come to the Discord and send a message here so at least I hear the beep. I can jump over and check it out and see what's going on there. But yeah, let's talk about some of these JavaScript array methods. Just to get started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some dummy data that we can work with. So let's start with, let me think about how we should do this. All right, let's just start with an array of objects. We'll call it OBJARR for object array. All right, and so what we'll put in here is let's make some people. We'll say name Bob, age 31, is employed, and we'll set this to true. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And we can actually, let's close the console, let's close the sidebar. So now we just have, yeah, that looks a little bit better. All right. So we're going to take this object and let's actually make a copy of it. Let's say Sarah, and she is 42, and she's employed. And then we could say that Jeff is 50, and we'll say that he's not employed. And let's add one more for good measure. We can say that Alice is 22 and also unemployed. Maybe we can make this a little bit smaller. So this is the object that we're working with right now. So there's three things that we're going to go over specifically, and these are JavaScript array methods. So we have map, we have filter, and we have reduce. And while we're on the topic, we might as well go through for each as well. And let's make these lowercase just for good measure. All right. So JavaScript array methods. They're all pretty simple. I had to do some research on reduce because I almost just never have to use it. I don't know that I've ever actually had to use it. And I think that usually when you're using the reduce method, there's another way that you can be accomplishing the same thing. And because the reduce method is just sort of complicated, I think it's very common for people to avoid it. Now, there are definitely times where even if you can do the exact same thing with map and filter, it might be more performant to do it with reduce. So when you're using map, when you're using filter, you're going to be creating a copy of the array. That means you're creating a new object every time you run those. With reduce, you're returning a single item. Now that item can also be an array, in which case you're also going to be creating a new array, a new object. But reduce isn't just, and it's not just a method to spit out an array. You can use reduce and you could return any value that you want to. It can be an array, an object, an integer, a string. It can really be anything. So we'll go through that in just a few minutes. But let's start off with the easy ones first. Let's check out the for each method. What do we call this? Let's change the name from array object to people. All right. So the for each method is probably the most common one that you're going to use when you're iterating through an array. So if you're in the process of learning JavaScript, then you're probably familiar with this syntax. You have a for loop. So let's say for, and then the arguments that you're going to be passing in here, the first one is going to be the variable that you're starting with. So we'll declare a variable. We'll say let I. Actually, let's not say I. Whenever I use I, I'm always trying to reserve that for an index. So, okay, I'm trying to make sure I don't make this confusing. Let's say for let person, because we're going to be iterating through the people array, the people object array, and so each of those is going to be a person. And then we're going to use a semicolon. The next one is going to be how are we incrementing the index so that we can move on to the next value. So we're going to say if you know what, I'm realizing that I'm only going to make this more confusing. Let's start with a better example. Okay, we'll say we have an array of my numbers. And we have 1 through 9. We'll say my numbers dot for each. We're going to start with a for loop. For let I, if I is less than my numbers dot length I plus plus, because we're referring to the index here. So if we just console log I, remember JavaScript is it's 0 indexed. So even though this number is 1, the index is going to be 0. The number here is 2, the index is going to be 1. So if we save this, let's take a look at the log here. All right, why is this not logging out? Oh, let's instantiate this. There we go. All right. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It should go to 8. So that's what I is. I is essentially the index. If we break this down, we're setting the index to 0. If we wanted to set it to 1, we could, and then the numbers would actually match up with the index. So let's do this. We'll log the index. Maybe we can do a table instead. And then let's also log the number. And so the way we're going to access the number is by taking my numbers, and then we want the value at the index. So we actually need to change this back to 0 so that the indexes are going to be correct. So we're setting I for, let's actually change this to index just to avoid any confusion. And then since the name and the value, the key and the value are both the same, we can just leave index in there. Now, if we log this out, let's take a look. We have, let's go up to the top here. We have an index of 0, a number of 1, index of 1, a number of 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, all the way down. So this is a typical for loop. Now, it's a little bit verbose. This is a lot to type out if you just want to iterate through an array. So the easier way to do it would be my numbers dot for each. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pass in an arrow function. It doesn't have to be an arrow function. You could actually just declare a function like this. It would be an anonymous function, but typically what you're going to see out in the wild, it's going to be an arrow function. And then the parameter that we're going to define inside of the arrow function, or the argument that we're going to pass in or create, is going to be the value for each individual item in this array. So for my numbers, each individual item should be called number. That would logically follow. Now it can be named anything. It doesn't matter what you name it. But this is a new variable that's going to be created on every single pass, on every iteration. So we'll call it number. And then if we log it out, let's do that. So now you see we're getting these numbers. If we wanted to do the same thing here, let's change this to console log. We'll just make these match. And then we would say my numbers at the index, and we will call this number. So now we have the same thing happening twice. Let's actually do this as well. We'll say for each. And then here, let's log out for loop. All right, so let's take a look at what we have here. The for loop, we have all of the numbers logging out, and the for each loop, same thing. We have all of the numbers. And you can see that one of these has a much simpler syntax than the other. We can even simplify this further, and we can put it all in one line, and we get the exact same result. Now, what you will generally see when you're working with a for loop is it will just say I. That's sort of the go-to for me. But I stands for index. So this is probably a little bit more common. But again, just to show, they both do the exact same thing. Now, in this top one here, if we want to log out the index, all we have to do is log out I. On this one, if we also want the index, and let's do it like this. We'll log it out in the same log. Now, if we want the index in the second one, we have to add a second argument here. Let's call it I to keep it consistent. And then we can save that. So if we take a look at the for loop up at the top here, you can see that we have the index and we have the number. Then the for each loop, we have the index and the number. So I'm sure you can see why for each loops are more popular these days. It's just less syntax to memorize. I think it's a little bit more intuitive. It has more of a functional feel to it because everything's moving from left to right. Not that it's not moving from left to right here, but I think intuitively this seems to make more sense to more people. It's the more comfortable syntax for most people. All right, so that's the easy one. That's probably the first JavaScript array method that you're going to learn. So the syntax, if we wanted to call this, we can call it on any array, even if there's no values in there. We'll say for each item, console log item. Now there's nothing in here, so nothing's going to log out, but let's do it anyways. So there's nothing there. As soon as we put a few values in here, there we go, they log out. So it doesn't just have to be a variable. It doesn't have to be an array that was created earlier in the code. You can literally create the array and then you can start looping over it. Now you can also do the same thing with objects here. But let's take this people array that we created and let's use that one. What do we call it? People. Okay. So for each person and people, we want to log that out. So let's change this from item to person. And there we go. We have all 4 people. The objects are printing out exactly as we would expect. So now what happens if we only want to pull out people who are under the age of 40? If you wanted to do that with a for each method, we could say people.forEach person. And then we run into an issue here where we need to create a mutation. There's nothing wrong with mutations, but the more mutations you have, the more there's more surface area where things can go wrong with your code. I tend to opportunistically go for like a more functional style. I won't go out of my way to make my functions pure, but when I have the opportunity to do it and it makes sense to do it, I will do that. So again, let's do this. I'm actually going to use const instead of let, because even with const, you can still modify objects, and an array is an object. So let's say formatted people, or we'll say people under 40. And we'll make that an empty array. Now for each person, what we want to do is we want to check if they're under 40. So we'll say if person.age is less than 40, then what we want to do is we want to push that value into the array. So we'll say people under 40.push person. All right, then let's log out people under 40. We'll comment that out, and let's see what this gives us. So here we have an array with 2 objects in it. Those objects would be Bob and Alice. Bob is 31, Alice is 22. So we've essentially just filtered this array. We went from having 4 people where 2 of them were under 40 and 2 of them were over 40. And now we have a new array with 2 people, both under the age of 40. Now, a better way to go about this, we can get the exact same thing with a little bit less complication, I would say, by using the filter method. So if we say people.filter, and let's just comment this out as well. People.filter, it's going to be the same syntax. So we're going to say person. And then what we want to do is we want to specify what are we returning. So in this case, again, we only want to return if the person is under age 40. So we can just quite literally copy this, person.age is less than 40, and we can return that. So since we're returning something, what we can do is we can assign it to a variable here. And we'll call it people under 40 again. We'll take this console log, we'll uncomment it, and now let's see what happens. And here we go, we have the exact same thing. again, what we can do is we can get rid of this return statement. We can get rid of the brackets and the colon there, the semicolon. We can put it all in one line. And now suddenly we have a nice inline filter method. We're getting people under 40. Let's just name it to under 40. And there we go. Again, nice and clean and easy to read. So filter is, it's very nice. Anytime that you want to take any array, any set of data, and you want to just filter out by a certain criteria, filter is excellent. I love the filter method. I use it all the time. Now, one of the more complicated ones is the map array. So now we have this array called under 40. So now what do we do if we want to change how the data is structured? That's where map comes in. So we can say under 40 dot map. So just like filter, we're going to return a value here. And again, we're going to use the same syntax. So all we have to do is specify how we want this person to be reformatted. So maybe we want our array object to look like this. Instead of saying age 31 and is employed, maybe we want to do this. We want to say name equals person.name, and let's make it all lowercase. Okay. Now the next one, we'll set a Boolean to say under 30, true or false. Under 30. So here we can say person.age is under 30. And now if we log this out, again, we need to save the value. Let's console log under 30. And see what we have here. So we have Bob, again, lowercase, because again, we transformed this. We made a modification. And Alice, again, also lowercase. Now they both have this under 30 value. For Bob, it's false because Bob is over 30. And for Alice, under 30 is true because Alice is under 30. So one more thing that's pretty cool about this is we can chain these together. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to get rid of that under 30 value, or that under 40 value rather. And then we'll delete everything here. And we can just chain this map value right onto the filter. And now that it's going to be taking up more than one line, let's go ahead and do this to make it a little bit more readable. So we're going to take the people array. Yeah, so we're taking this people array, which is an array of objects. We're filtering it if the person is under 40, and then we're mapping the data to change the structure to the person's name with lowercase, and then to check if they're under 30 or to set that Boolean value. So let's go ahead and save this. We'll call this under 30. And again, we're logging that out right here, under 30. So if we save this, we get the exact same thing. We have Bob, he's under 30, or he's not under 30. Alice, she is under 30. So we're starting with 4 people, we're filtering it down to 2 people, and then we're changing the structure of the data. So I'll just throw in a comment here. Filter people under 40. And then we'll add another one right here. And this is going to be change data structure. So when you think about what map is doing, all we're doing is we're saying we have these values, or we have this object called person. We want the same object, we just want to change the structure of it. So we're mapping the data onto a new object and returning that. Now, one of the things that I didn't connect really well with when I first learned these JavaScript array methods is I didn't understand why you can't just add some logic like this. So maybe, for example, if person.age is less than 40, then we want to return this value. And we can get rid of this filter method here. So we're taking people and we're mapping it, but we're only returning it if the person is under age 40. This intuitively is what I would think you would do. But let's take a look at what happens if we log this out. Now, we still only have 2 values, and we actually have the structure of the data exactly how we want it, but now we have these 2 undefined values because map is going to be returning something on every iteration. And so when there's nothing to return, it sort of implicitly returns undefined. So that is that's important to notice, is that you can't use conditionals like this inside of person. Now, if you wanted, you can put an else statement in here, and you could say return, and then maybe let's just add some nonsense here. And now you can see that we have some pretty useless looking data right now. But the point that I'm trying to make is you can't filter out this data. If there are 4 objects inside of the array, you're going to get 4 objects back. So that's why you can't filter data with map. What you can do, however, and let's just clean this up real quick. What you can do is, let's actually do the same thing again. Let's add that filter in there. We'll say if person.age is greater than 40, I'm sorry, we want to say is less than 40. So we have those undefined values again. What we could do now is we could chain the filter method on there. And we're going to create that variable called person again. Now remember that this is a new scope right here, which is why we can reuse the same value. Just make sure that you understand that because the names are the same, it's not going to give you access to this person value. So if we just name that underscore, and now we try to console log person, we're going to get an error. And that's because we're outside of the context. So person isn't defined in this block right here. Person is only defined here. There's some interesting things to be said about using var. If you use var instead of let or const, the values will be global, but we don't want that. It's a very bad practice, and it's not even worth getting into right now. Anyways, if we name this back to person, now we can say if person is not null, so we'll use the double bang operator, return person. And again, we get the same thing as we did originally, where we have the 2 values and everything's filtered correctly. So we can filter it before, we can filter it after. You just can't filter with a map function. And yeah, so those 2 are pretty easy. There's nothing too complicated about that. One more thing that I should mention, let's get rid of the filter method for a second here. And let's, if you need the index for any reason, all you need to do is you can put the index in right there as the second argument. So now if we console log the index, or let's just add it to the object actually. The index is I. So now let's take a look at the results. We have an array with 4 objects, and the middle 2 are undefined. Let's actually undo that because that example is done. You don't want to filter things inside of map. That's the point I was trying to make. Okay, so we take a look at this. Now we have Bob, and the index is 0. For Sarah, the index is 1. Jeff is 2, and the index is 3 for Alice. So that's how you get access to the index when you're using map, filter, reduce. We could do the same thing with filter. The second argument is going to be the index. All right, so hopefully those are both relatively clear. And let's get to reduce, because I think that's the most complicated one. So let's say that we want to do the same thing. Let's just put some notes in here. We'll say filter people over 40 out of the array. And the second thing we want to do is reshape the array with the index and a Boolean for under 30. So let's do the same thing, but we're going to do that with a reducer. And usually the examples that you're going to see with a reducer, they're going to take place on, we'll say, like an array of numbers. The most common example is getting the sum of an array of numbers. So let's actually start there before we get to the objects. We'll say const sum equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then let's add the reduce method on here. Dot reduce. So we'll get to what the values are that we're going to pass into it. But as you can see here, we're passing in a callback function because we need to do something in here. So we need a function so we can specify what it is. And we'll go through all of the arguments in just a second. One thing that's important to know, and if you use React, you might be familiar with this because useEffect has the array dependency. So similarly, we're going to use that same type of syntax. What we're going to pass in here is the starting value for what's called the accumulator. Now, the accumulator, in this instance, let's call it total. Let's call it sum. No, let's call it total. I don't want to start doubling up on variable names. So the first value is what's called an accumulator. It's going to be passed through every iteration. So to get the sum, we're going to loop through this. On the first iteration, we're going to have the number 1. On the second iteration, we're going to have the number 2. The third iteration, we're going to have the number 3. So essentially, we want to start with a value of 0. So the second argument in reduce is going to be the starting value. So let's say 0. And we'll play with that in just a minute. What's going to happen behind the scenes is JavaScript is going to take this 0 and it's immediately going to assign it to this value total, like this. So that's going to happen behind the scenes. Now, the second one is going to be the current value. So that's going to be the value at the index for the current iteration. So let's just actually match these names here. We'll call this current value. And then the third one is going to be the index. We'll call it current index. Let's just call it index. Let's just change this to value. Okay, so the last one, this array value, let's leave that out. We don't actually need that right now, and I don't want to overcomplicate this. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the current value and we want to add that to the total. So we'll say total plus equals value. Now, the other thing about the reduce method is that you need to return a value from each iteration. So the value that you're going to return is going to be added to this accumulator right here. So another way that we can do this, instead of saying total plus equals value and then returning total, we can literally just return total plus value. So I know that this might be a little bit confusing. Let's do a console log of the index here, just so we can see which iteration we're on. And then let's also log out the total and the value. All right. And then at the bottom here, let's log out the sum. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's go up to the top here. So first on index 0, which is iteration 1, our total is going to be 0 because we're passing in this value of 0. We're saying we want to start with 0. The value is 1 because that's the value at the first index of this array. And then what we're doing is we're returning the total plus the value. So we're returning 0 plus 1. Since we're returning 1, that's going to be the new total for the next iteration. So here, if we take a look, you can see the same thing. The total is 1, and now we have a total value of 2. I'm sorry, not a total value. We have a value of 2 because that's the second item inside of this array. And we're returning 1 plus 2, which is 3. So on the third iteration at the second index, now our total is coming in at 3. The value is also 3. So we're returning the total plus the value, which is 6. So on the third iteration, the third index, now we're starting with 6. So I'm sure you could see here that whatever we're returning is this starting value. Normally when you see this in the wild, you're going to see it as ACC for accumulator. So hopefully that makes sense. I know it's a little bit confusing, but I think it's one of those things that if you just practice, you'll get a lot more comfortable with it. And, when in doubt, just console log it. Just take a look at what the values are that you're working with, and it should hopefully clarify this stuff for you. Now, if we change this from 0 to 10, you see how the sum is 45. So if we change this to 10, let's see what happens now. The sum is 55 because we're starting at 10. Then we're adding 1 to 10. So the next total is going to be 11. Then we're adding 2 to 11. So the next total is 13, and so on and so forth. So where reduce really starts getting complicated is when you're using an array of objects. But just like we saw a few minutes ago, if we wanted to filter and map the data, we had to do that as, what am I trying to say here? We had to do that with two separate array methods. We had to filter it, and then we had to map it, or we had to map it and then filter it. And for the record, I would filter first. I don't like what I did on that on the last round, where I returned those undefined values and then filtered them out. That's not a good practice. If you can avoid doing that, you should. But the cool thing about reduce is that we can actually map and filter at the exact same time. So let's say const people, we'll call it under 30. And this is going to be equal to people.reduce. Okay, so the value that we're passing in is going to be a callback function. We're going to define it on the spot. And the starting value for this one, we can make this an empty array, since essentially what we're doing is we want to return another array with new objects. So this is where I say that if you use React, the syntax might look a little bit familiar. In React, we have use effect, and then it has the callback function. You have some stuff in here, and then you have a dependency array in there. And if you only want it to run once, you have an empty array. So the syntax might look a little bit familiar. Anyways, okay, so we're passing in this value here. The first one is the accumulator. We'll call it ACC for accumulator. The next one is the current value. And then we don't have to add any more arguments because we have the index and then we have that array. So let's just see, and full transparency, like I said earlier, I just don't use reducers pretty much at all in my daily life. So I've just had to learn all this in the last 2 days. So don't take my word for everything 100%. I would definitely recommend doing a little bit of your own research, but I think I have a pretty reasonable understanding of how it works now. Okay. Let's do this first. Let's also pass in the index. And then let's just console log. So we'll console log the accumulator, the current, and then the index. Now, if we do this, I'll tell you what will happen right away. What's going to happen is we're only going to get one value back. I think that's what's going to happen, because think about this. We're not returning any values out of this right now. So then when it goes around for the second iteration, it's not going to have anything to operate off of. So let's take a look. Let's see if that's in fact what happens when we run this. Okay, so it did go through the iteration, but let's look at the data. So the accumulator is the empty array. The current value is the first index inside of this array, which is Bob. And then we have the index. But if we look at the second one here, the accumulator is undefined. We still have the index and we have the current value, but we're not passing anything to the accumulator. So if we console log under 30, you'll see that we're not getting anything useful here. We're not getting anything at all, actually. It's undefined. So now if we just return current, now let's take a look again, and this under 30 value, it just comes out to be the last value. See, we have Alice, she's age 22, and she is employed, because it's going through the first one and it's returning this first object. It goes through the second one, it returns the second object. The third one returns the third object. The fourth one returns the fourth object. So the fourth object eventually overwrites everything else. So there's a few different ways that we can go about this. The first thing, let's actually move these comments in here. So we'll say filter people over 40 out of the array, and then reshape the value. So first, let's start by filtering it. We're going to take the, I'm trying to think about how I want to do this. I think a good way to go about this would be to take the accumulator, because again, if we look at the first one, we just have this empty array, because that's what we're passing in here is the dependency. So I would say that we can take the current, value and say accumulator.push current, and then return. I'm actually not 100% sure this is going to work, so bear with me while I kind of figure this out. I'll leave this console log up here at the top. All right, so let's see what this gives us. So under 30, we're getting all of the information back, because all we're doing is we're taking that empty array that we're starting with, we're passing a value into it, and then we're going through the next iteration of the loop. So let's actually look at this step by step. The first one, the accumulator is all of the values. And then in the second one, we have all of the This actually surprises me. I think this might be one of those situations where if I were to expand this quicker, we would have a different option, or we'd have different values in there. So let me find a better way to represent this. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to, let's start by creating a new array. We'll just call it new array. And then let's say that if the person is over the age of 40, we're going to remove them. So if they're under 40, we're going to add it to the new array. So if current dot age is less than 40, then we're going to new array dot push the current value. So let's see what we get here now. In the first iteration, we have an empty accumulator, again, because that's the value we're passing in, so that's our starting value. And then we're taking the current value, which is Bob, on this first iteration. We're passing it into the new array object, and then we're returning the accumulator. No, I'm sorry, we don't want to return the accumulator. We want to return new array. Okay, so exact same thing as before. Now, if we take a look at the second iteration, we can see that the accumulator is now an array with one value, which is Bob. It's the Bob object. Now, if we take a look at the second one, just keep in mind we're logging this out on each one. So even if this doesn't happen, we're still logging everything out. But now you can see the accumulator is empty. The current value is Jeff. And then we take a look at the third one. Again, the accumulator is empty. We have Alice. And then this under 30 array, if we take a look at this, we only have Alice in there. Why is that? So if current.age is less than 40, new array.push current, and then return new array. I see. What we need to do here is we actually need to destructure the accumulator so that we can take those previous values and we can add it to the array. So now we'll get exactly what we're looking for. Under 30 is now going to be Bob and Alice, because Bob is 31, Alice is 22, and that's exactly what we got. So we filtered it. Now, I know I did a horrible job explaining that, but hopefully you still get the point of it. So I just make this a little bit smaller so we can see a little bit more. Now, this is essentially acting as a filter function. This is exactly the same thing that filter would do. And, you know, that's cool. Nothing wrong with that. I'm going to make this a little bit less verbose. And we could make this even a little bit less code by also just returning this. And then we can say else return accumulator. So let's see what this gives us now. Okay, it's saying something's not iterable. Oh, we're not returning this. Okay, there we go. So, same thing with a little bit less code. So, now what we can do here is if we want to also reshape the data, we can actually start by doing this. I'm going to put these back in curly braces. So now this current value, what we can do is we can actually reshape this. So we could say current.name.toLowercase, and this is going to be name. And then the next one is going to be under 30, and the value of this is going to be current.age is less than 30. So if we take a look at this now, not only have we filtered it, but we've also mapped the array. So here we're essentially getting filter and map both in the same body here. We can get rid of the index because we don't need that here. And one more thing that would make this even a little bit less verbose. I'm not 100% sure that this will work, but let's take a look. Let's try it. I always love experimenting with this stuff. So if we get rid of this if else statement. And instead, we say if current age is less than 40, then we want to return this array. Okay, I guess it won't work that way. All right, nothing wrong with that. Let's just change how this is formatted. Let's say if the current age is greater than 40, we just want to return. Otherwise, we want to return the new values here. So there we go. We have the same thing again. So the way that I'm going to think of reduce moving forward is essentially like a combination of map and filter. I don't think that that's how most people would describe it, but that's sort of the explanation that sits with me. Not because it's going to map and filter your data, but because you can add logic for mapping and filtering in there together. What you could also do is if you don't want to return another array of objects, which with map and filter, you're going to be returning the same data type, we could very simply just return strings out of here. We can get rid of the array entirely. So let's try one more thing here. I think this, if that didn't click for you, maybe this example will. So let's delete this. Let's say that we have two arrays. We have one array that's people under 30. Or we'll say 40. We'll have two arrays. An under 30 array. Okay, I just said 40. We want an under 40 array and an over 40 array. So let's say that we want to return a single object with two arrays. So let's show what this would look like. We have an object, and it's going to say under 40, and that's going to be Bob and Alice, I think. And then we're going to have over 40. And that's going to be Sarah and Jeff. So if we want to get this value right here, let's rename this to over under. If we want to get that value, we need to think about it this way. So what's going to be our starting value? It's going to be an empty object, because that's what we want to return. So that's going to be the value that we're going to mutate. So what we're going to do first and foremost is we're going to see if the person's age, let's actually change this a little bit. Let's call this, I'm trying to think of the best way to demonstrate this. I'm going to change Jeff and Alice both to age 50. And then we have Bob at 31, Sarah at 42. So let's do it like this instead. Let's have the ages where it says 31, 42. So for 31, we're going to have Bob. For 42, we're going to have Sarah. And then for 50, we're going to have Jeff and Alice. Okay, this should be a better example. Okay. So we're going to check if the accumulator has the key with the number value. So we can say accumulator, and then we're going to check for a key of the current.age. So we're going to make this an if statement, and we're going to say if this is not null. So if it's not null, then what we're going to do is we're going to push the value into that array. Let's reverse how we do this. Let's see if it's null first, because if it's null, then what we want to do is want to assign it to an empty array. So we're going to say accumulator at current.age equals, and then we want the person's name in lowercase. So we'll say equals current.name. dot2 lowercase. And we're getting an error because we're not returning anything here. And then we're going to say else. So if the value is not null, wait a minute, I'm sorry. I got a little bit ahead of myself here. We don't want this yet. This is the else statement. So if there is no current age, if that key doesn't exist yet, then what we're going to do is we're going to take accumulator, and then we want to set that to the age. And oh yeah, I think I did have it right. But we want this to be inside of an array. Otherwise, we're just going to take current at current.age, which we already know is an array at this point. And we want to push that. We want to push the current person in there. So current.currentAge.push current.name.to lowercase. And we're going to want to return the accumulator for the next iteration. So let's take a look at what we get. And okay, so something's not working. Let's debug a little bit. So if the accumulator does not have the current age as a key, then we want to set it to an empty array. Let's make this a little bit more readable. Okay, so we're setting it to an empty array. We're pushing the name into that empty array. Otherwise, we're just taking the current age as the key for the accumulator. That's the issue. Okay, that should work. Sorry, I tend to make everything overly complicated sometimes. So now, if we take a look up here, 31, 42, 50, 31, 42, 50, Bob, Sarah, Jeff, Alice. Bob, Sarah, Jeff, Alice. So we got our data exactly how we wanted it. Now, like I tried doing originally, let's do this again. We'll just put it in there and get rid of the second one. And we should have the exact same result with, again, a little bit of a nicer syntax. Or we can even put that on one line, as I tend to like to do, even though it's probably not the best, probably not the best practice in the world. I don't know why I've taken to that recently, but I have. So, take it for what it's worth. See, so this is nice, neat, clean, readable, and it completely transforms and filters our data. So I think as far as practically speaking for the reduce method, one of the more complicated things you're going to run into is reducing an array of objects. So this should be a good example of how you would do that. So those are the big ones. And that's, to be completely honest, that's the best understanding that I have of it. Now, if we also wanted to do this, we can just keep chaining these together. We can add a dot filter. We can add a dot map. Whatever you want to do, you can keep chaining them together over and over and over again. You can even map another reducer onto here. And we can further modify this data. So that is the idea of it. And now I don't have anything specific to go over at the moment. So if anyone is here, which I don't know if anyone is. Okay. Oh yeah. All right, I didn't see you. Oh, okay. The Discord link is broken. Yeah, what's up? What's going on? What's your question? And while I'm waiting for you to ask, let's take a look at that. Interesting. Thanks for pointing that out. I'll fix that. I feel like such a boomer every time I use Discord. Where on earth is the share button? Here we go, invite people. All right, that link should work again now, or at least in a few minutes it should work. All right, so we'll wait a few more minutes and see if you're still here and you have any questions. We'll go over it. I'm really not a big fan of the reducers. Now that I understand them a little bit better, I'm sure I'm probably going to use it at least a little bit more often. But you know, I think I probably prefer filter and map. I think it's maybe just a little bit more readable, especially like this. Whenever you see reducers, like I said, if you see them in the wild, if you're looking at a code base and you see a reducer, you're almost always going to see this first value as ACC for accumulator. And intuitively, accumulator doesn't really immediately click with me. So when I'm reading through this, you know, I can figure out what's happening, but it's going to take that extra little bit of mental energy to get there. All right, so I'm wondering if there's anything else that we can go over as far as array methods. Oh, okay. We can go over like this pop, shift it, unshift, push. I think I've showed delete before. I usually use that with objects, so I'm trying to clean objects up. And then slice and splice. I love the JavaScript array methods. They're kind of fun to work with. All right. So let's move on. Let's do one more thing before I call it a day here. And I'm not going to get into Git today, although I am looking forward to going over that. I was thinking about going over Vuex, but that might be better for another time. Let's actually take a look at, where did I share this? I shared a list of things that I was interested in going over. JavaScript array methods, TypeScript for JavaScript developers, learning Go, reviewing apps, SQL databases, building a REST API with Express, to-do list with React, debugging projects, and using GitHub. Something that we could do really quickly is just throw together a really simple API with Express. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but it could be a nice, quick, easy thing to get into here. So let's take a look at the project structure, and real quick I'll double check. Okay, still no questions. So let's do this. We're going to close the web page. Let me actually make this a little bit smaller so it's how I like it next time I jump in there. We'll set this to be the full screen. Make this a little bit bigger. And then, as you can see, we actually have a project here. So instead of running it with live server, the way it's running right now, I'm going to click, I'm going to close live server. I'll get rid of all of this code here. And then if we take a look at our package.json, you can see I installed nodemon. And what it's doing is every time anything inside of this source folder is modified, it's going to restart the development server. So you can see here that instead of saying nodemon, if we just did node, what it would do is it would run index.js. But since we're using nodemon, we can say we want it to watch the source folder. So that's a dev dependency. So when we build this and we push it to production, it's not going to be there. It's strictly for development. What I'm going to do though, however, is I'm going to say npm run serve, which is the name of that script that I set up. That starts the server. But first, let's actually install Express. So npm I for install, and then Express. I personally love Express. Express is what I'm going to use most of the time when I'm building an API, like the vast majority of the time. So let's, if you're not familiar with how to import things or how to require them with JavaScript, I guess you'll get a little taste of how to do that right now, but this isn't going to be like a full-blown tutorial. This is kind of just like, I'm going to run through it just for the fun of it right now. So let's say const express equals require express. Now this can be named anything. We're calling it express by convention because that's what it's called in the package. It's actually called express, but that can actually be anything. When we require it, we're telling the application which package to use. So if we go into our node modules, we can see that express is actually installed here. Should be installed here. I don't think I've ever looked at this, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't. Oh yeah, right here. Okay, so if we look at the index, you can see that it's exporting. Yeah, okay, we're using default exports, so it really doesn't matter what we name it. If it was a named export, we would import it like this. But since it's just a default export, we can give it whatever name we'd like. Alright, so what we need to do is we need to start the server. We need to give it a port that we want it to listen on, and we need to tell it to listen. So the way that we're going to do this is first we're going to register this application as an Express application. So we'll say const app equals Express. We're going to call that Express method there. And now we can say app.listen, and then we define the port and a callback method. So let's say we want to listen on port 3000, and the callback method can be console log listening at localhost 3000. Now, what you're going to more commonly see is something like this. This might be process.env.port or 3000. In that case, you would have .env installed normally, so it parses your environment variables, and then you would have a .env file where you have the port defined, and it would look like this. But what we're going to do for now is we're just going to say 3000. Here we're going to call port, and then here we can use our string interpolation and call the port. So now if we run this, it says listening at localhost 3000, but there's nothing that we can do yet. Okay, so now we're all in on this thing. So let's say app.get, and then we define an endpoint here. So let's just make this the default endpoint. And then we have this callback function, and it's going to have two arguments in here. It's going to have the request and the response. There's also next function, or normally it'll just be called next. And we can also pass in an error in there, but we don't need to worry about any of that right now. All we need is request and response. And we're going to use REQ and RES, for shorthand. So think about this. If you go to localhost 3000, it's going to bring you here because we're not specifying anything. If we say puppies, then you would need to go to localhost 3000/puppies to call this endpoint. So let's just get rid of that, and we're going to say when we go to localhost 3000, what do we want to happen? And what I'm going to say is that we want to do res.send. And then what do we want to send? Let's just add some HTML here. All right, let's try that. So now if we go to localhost 3000, there we go, we have hello world. We're quite literally just sending HTML in the form of a string right to the server. Now let's just copy this endpoint, and let's make that puppy endpoint that we talked about before. /puppies. And then make this say I love puppies. So now if we take a look here again, if we refresh it, we get the same thing, hello world. Now /puppies, and we get I love puppies. So that's another way that you can build your web app. Instead of doing res.send, you can do res.render, and then you can actually specify an HTML file. So the thing is, I don't use this enough to actually remember how it works, so I'm not going to do it right now. But that's how it would be done. Now let's take a look at the request. Let's console log request. And then let's refresh this puppies page and take a look at the results here. So there's a lot of information here. And we definitely don't need to go through all of this. Now, the headers, you don't need to worry too much about this right now. But what I do with headers, let's say I have an API and we can only let someone access certain data if they're logged in as an administrator. We might have some logic on the back end that takes a cookie or a JSON web token, and then it runs it through some sort of validator to make sure, yeah, this is a valid token, and this person is, in fact, an administrator, so go ahead and send them the data that they're requesting. And then you could have two different things here. So let's get rid of the puppies endpoint. I just want to focus on one thing at a time here. So before we get into that, let's check the parameters. So what you can do, if you want to specify parameters, you can use this syntax where it's a colon and then let's say ID. So if we want to get the value for anything after this, so let's say we're going to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, so there's nothing there. But now we have this parameter. So what we can do is we can say request.params.id. We'll set that to a value. We'll set that to a variable called ID. And then let's res.send. We'll put the ID in here. All right, so let's see what happens now. We get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's how you would pass parameters from the front end to the back end. You can also do it through the body, but I'm not gonna get into that right now because we don't have like a proper REST API setup. I don't want to have to set up Axios and all that and like create an actual front end like a Vue. So we're going to just leave it at this for now. But we could add some conditional logic and we could say if ID, we'll say if ID is less than 5,000. Now keep in mind ID is going to be a string because it's getting it from the parameters. So we're going to have to parse this integer because we're using the logical operator to see if it's less than 5,000. We can't check if a string is less than 5,000, so we need to turn it into an integer. We can also do it like this. Parse int. There we go. So let's say that people with an ID under 5,000 aren't supposed to be able to access this. So let's say instead of res.send, let's do res.status. And we'll say 401. And if I'm not mistaken, I think we can also do this. .send. Let's just copy this right here. And we'll say unauthorized. Otherwise, we want to send the same page that we had before. So let's take a look. We'll go to 4,000. User 4,000 is unauthorized. Now if we change it to 5,000, or 50,000 rather, it works. It actually prints out their ID. We'll say user is authorized. And if we get rid of this .send, let's try this again. So again, 5,000 is authorized. Now 200, oh wait a minute, what do we do here? If the ID is less than 5,000, then they're going to be unauthorized. Let's check the network tab. And right here, it's, oh, I see what we're doing. So we're sending no matter what. If we just add else, then we should be good. And what's the logic say? If the ID is less than 5,000, we'll set res.status to 200, which is success, and we'll send that. And we'll say unauthorized. Okay, but we need to look at the network tab here. Okay, user 200 is unauthorized, and if we take a look at the API call, we can see we get a status code of 401, unauthorized. And if we change this from 200 to 20,000, now user 200 is authorized. If we take a look at the API call, we see that it's 200. It's okay. So that's how it works. One more important thing I want to point out here is that instead of send, we can also use JSON. And then let's create an object here. So we'll say user ID is going to be ID. Status is going to be 401. and state is going to be unauth. And then if we do the same thing here, instead of doing .send, we could do .json. And let's just copy this object here. Let's change this from unauth to auth. We'll change this from 401 to 200. And now let's try this again. So user ID 200. The user ID is 200, the status is 401, and the state is unauth. If we change it to 20,000, we have the user ID 20,000, the status 200, which is okay, and then the state to auth. So that's just some of the very basics about building an API. Of course, there's a lot more to get into. This is about as basic as it gets. And we'll go over this stuff a little bit more proper at some point in the future. But I think that's it for today. That's about as much as I am up for going over at the moment. But again, join the Discord. The link is in the description. I just updated it, so it should be working now. If you have any questions, anything that you want to go over, if you want to look through a project together, anything at all like that, just let me know. I might do another stream tomorrow. I took the day off of work just because there's no work for me to actually do tomorrow. My my manager is out of the office, and I need her approval before I can move on to the next work. So I'm not going to be working tomorrow, so I'll probably be here doing the same thing. So definitely reach out if you have any questions or anything that you want to talk about. I'll be here, and I'm looking forward to the next one. But if you came by and watched, thanks for checking it out. And I look forward to talking with you guys a little bit more in the future.